Afternoon, everybody. I can't see you. Hopefully you can see me. Can you hear me okay, James? You can hear all okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about this sunflower study. I suspect some of you know quite a bit about it. Some of you have never heard of it, and some of you might have know a little bit. So forgive me for those who know lots about this. And I suppose the background is, for years, I have been involved in the debate about whether you should do operative cholangiograms during a laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Until about 5 years ago, I did it on absolutely everybody. So thousands of patients, I would have, whatever their LFTs, whatever their pre-operative imaging, I always did an operative cholangiogram. And I've always hoped that we could do some sort of trial to see if it's really worthwhile, because there are strong arguments for both doing them and for not doing them. And what became apparent in this country and in many countries around the world is that it's a waste of time trying to do such a trial, because very few people in this country will do a cholangiogram at all. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later. So we came up about the second best thing, to look at MRCP to assess the bile duct in low and moderate risk patients of having bile duct stones. So this was a trial we got money for, about 4.5 million quid from the NHR, from the NHS, about 4 or 5 years ago. And it was hugely supported by Augis, by GBI HPBA, by Leeds and Bristol Universities and Leeds Trust. And I suppose as surgeons, we all assume it's taught to us from day one that bile duct stones should be removed. They can cause terrible problems of pancreatitis, cholangitis, life-threatening events. And there's a huge paranoia, I think, within surgeons that they might miss a common bile duct stone and end up in a court of law because a patient got a second episode of pancreatitis and got really ill or died, and they didn't look at the bile duct. So I think there's a huge amount of defensive medicine. I think it's true across a lot of surgery and a lot of medicine in the Western world, actually, that there's over-treatment because of paranoia and defensive medicine. But anyway, sticking to us. But we have to remember that only a small percentage of patients do actually get bile duct stones. It's certainly less than 10%. It's probably nearer 7 or 8%, and that most of these stones will just pass on their own into the duodenum without any interference at all. And probably half of these patients are completely asymptomatic. Only half of them present with the sort of symptoms that I've mentioned. And the other thing that's clearly going on in the world, and this was shown very nicely in the COLES study, which was done by people like you guys a few years ago, where 3 months of consecutive lap choles were looked at. We know that nearly a third of patients now with symptomatic gallstones end up getting an MRCP, which is quite remarkable since such a small percentage actually have bile duct stones that stick around. And the other obvious thing that came out was what I've already said, which is that nobody likes doing cholangiograms. They take time and they can't be bothered. And on the COLES study, only 6 or 7% of people actually got a cholangiogram. Are those slides moving along, guys?
Yeah, it's working perfectly.
Okay, so your typical patient, you're on call, you get someone who comes in with pain, 50-year-old female, you think she's got gallstones, she has an ultrasound, she's got gallstones in her gallbladder, and she's got a 7mm common bile duct, and she's got those LFTs. I would bet £1 million that pretty much 99% of trainees and surgeons, consultant surgeons in this country, will ask for an MRCP because of that bilirubin of being 28. The bottom line is whether that patient's got a small stone in the bile duct or not, and there's just as much chance they haven't, the small stone will pass on its own almost certainly. So this is the typical sort of patient that we wanted to include in Sunflower. I'll take you through a little bit of the traumas and the ups and downs that we've had in the last 4 years for obvious reasons. But, you know, we've had a huge lot of interest across England, across Wales, across Scotland and Ireland. And these are all centres. We've got over 50 who have entered patients into this study. The original target was this number in the middle here, 13,500. I was laughed out of most auditoriums when I was presenting this trial before we started, and probably fairly so. You know, a surgical trial with 13,500 patients, pretty much no one had ever heard of. But we were going to randomise these patients of low and moderate risk of bile duct stones, and I'll tell you about that in a second, to a third having MRCP, so that roughly the same as what was already happening in the NHS, and 2/3 to be treated without an MRCP. Just crack on and take your gallbladder out. All patients would end up having their gallbladder out and then be followed up. So as you speak to the patient, I go through the whole spiel of why they need the gallbladder out, and then I finish up and say, well, there's something else I'd like to tell you. We've got a trial going of whether we further investigate your bile duct or not. And we do this with an MRI scan. So a third of patients will get an MRCP and 2/3 will get expectant management. And I just go through the advantages and disadvantages of each arm. So I always say the advantage of having an MRCP is that we may pick up an unlikely small stone in their bile duct. The disadvantage is pretty much, I say these days, you've got to come in and have a scan. People were getting twitched about the fact that an MRCP meant an ERCP, but I happen to know that very few patients have ended up needing ERCP at all. But that has been a fear of patients. In the expectant management group, there's the advantage that you don't need a scan, you don't have to come back and have a scan. But the disadvantage is that there may be a stone in the bile duct that you may suffer from down the line. We all know, and I suppose the classic patient I was trying to, for me, trying to avoid getting an MRCP ultimately, but we'll see what the trial shows, is the sort of patient who comes in, slightly deranged LFTs, has an MRCP, a small little filling defect at the bottom end of the bile duct. They get booked for an ERCP. They have their ERCP. The ERCP is completely normal, but they end up getting ERCP pancreatitis and stay on ITU for 2 months. You know, an completely unnecessary ERCP with a stone that has passed spontaneously on its own. And we all know the risks of ERCP. The inclusion criteria are important. They need to obviously pitch up with gallstones in their gallbladder. They need to be fit for lap chole, and they have these criteria of what we've defined as low to moderate risk of bile duct stones. So their bile duct needs to be 8 mil or less on ultrasound. The bilirubin needs to be 50 or less, although it can be higher and then go, the next day it might be down because the stone has passed. So these acute patients with high LFTs can still be put in, even if their LFTs move down to the normal range. And the way I describe ALT and ALT phos, because I can't do it as an inclusion criteria, is they are only excluded if both of these enzymes are 3 times the upper limit of normal. They both got to be 3 times the upper limit of normal for them not to go in. So what are our primary outcomes? In this study, we are looking at readmissions, people who come back with bile duct stone problems, people who get complications from their laparoscopic cholecystectomy. They might, you could argue that patients who have got a stone left in their bile duct are more likely to blow off their cystic duct clips and therefore end up with a bile leak. So readmissions for complications of surgery was important, we felt, and complications of ERCP. We also were part of the primary outcome. As we went through, I just thought I'd give you a bit of background of what we've done. So we first started recruiting at the beginning of 2019, and we ended up reaching our recruitment phase one target on time in about just before COVID actually, which surprised a lot of people. We needed about 1,700 patients, and we achieved that target, which you'll see on a graph in a minute. And we've now reached well over nearly 6,000 patients. We've had certain centres who've done extraordinarily well, like Nottingham a few months ago, recruited 51 patients in a month. And we've had a recent investigators meeting, which was our 5th. I'll just move on. So this graph tells the picture. You can see the red line. We were right on target. We started slightly late, so we're about a month behind, but we're basically, if you follow cricket score lines, you can see that we were going at the same rate, over by over. And then the pandemic hit us and we flatlined. And then since then, it's been tough. Not many hospitals have done elective coles. They've all been acutes. And slowly but surely, we've got started again, and we're now at about 6,000. And I'm going to take you through very briefly, because it might be helpful to you, just understanding trials a bit. We've looked at a new target to make this achievable, rather than trying to get to the 13,500 up here, because we should have finished recruiting last November, but we've now got an extension to our recruitment. We're now bumbling along at about 150 patients a month across the 50 sites, which is well below our target of nearly 400. Now we've got our extension, which I'll tell you about in a sec. I'm hoping this will improve. These are some of the hospitals, just a small number of them, who have done particularly well over the last 12 months. And you can see that overall, we do define whether a patient is elective or urgent, an urgent patient, because I actually deep down think the urgent ones are going to prove more interesting because they have the more deranged liver function tests. And about a third of our patients now are urgent and 2/3 are elective. The urgent ones are always more difficult, unless you've got an ambulatory surgical care type unit. These urgent ones are much more difficult to recruit because the patient's in pain, you're busy doing an acute ward round, etc. So I get it, it's hard, but they are the great ones to get in. So back to our primary outcomes. I went through those, and we wanted to see a few months ago if we could reduce our target number. And forgive me if I lose any of you. I hope I don't, because I often lose. I used to lose.
Or I think you've just popped on mute. Excellent.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
No idea what I did. So just to try and explain how we got this new target number, we had right at the beginning, we assumed that the number of patients who were going to have events, our primary outcome, readmissions, problems with their bile duct, complications, all that sorts of stuff, would be about 7% in both generally speaking, about 7% of people will come back with problems. And we decided that we would accept as clinicians a difference of 1.5%, so that if the expectant management group had a 8.5 readmission rate, and the MRCP group had a 7%, we would conclude that the EM was non-inferior. So we looked at this again, and we found out, because we're allowed to find out. As trialists, we're not supposed to find out the results mid-trial, but we needed to, and we found out that the primary outcome rate was actually a lot higher than 7%. And one of the reasons, almost certainly, is because when we first looked at what this outcome rate would be, we were really talking about a patient with bile duct stone problems. But as we developed the forms that people fill in, and we just didn't want to lose information, we wanted to include all the biliary events, people coming back with cholecystitis, people coming back with biliary colic, and I think we missed that a bit. And so because of the other thing that's happened during the pandemic, is that the time from randomization to surgery has increased so much. There have been many more events, in other words, many more readmissions of simple, cholecystitis, biliary colic. So that number of 7% is a whole lot higher than we expected. But because of that, we are able, because you've got a higher primary outcome rate, you are actually going to need less patients. Now, this top line is how we first worked out the initial sample size of 13,500. With 7%.
Slides have essentially dropped off. If
can you hear me now?
I can hear you. It's just that we've lost the slides.
All right, I'll go back to, hang on. Have you got that one?
No. Nothing yet.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got table 6. You can see.
You got that, table 6? So
yeah.
I only want you to look at a couple of lines on here. So the top line in grey is what we started with, an acceptance that there was a 1.5% chance of a difference, and that would be fine clinically. So slightly more if we treated all these people expectantly and we didn't MRCP everybody. That's the huge number we needed. But if we got a much higher event rate down at, say, 15%, and we proportionally increased that margin, so up to about 3%, with a 90% power, we'd only need about 6,000 patients. But we specifically want to look at the patients with bile duct problems. So with HES data, we're coding that specifically to look at problems that patients have with bile duct stones. And because of that, that's back down to 5%. And with only 80% power, we've come up with this figure of 7,500. So I've made that sound, well, maybe it's complicated, but that is how we have basically got to our new target rate of 7,500. We're at 6,000 and we need 1,500 more. And our extension is to 2024, halfway through 2024. So at 150 a year, we should easily reach that target. I think NIHR have given this extension because of a number of reasons. They do like the fact that this is a massive surgical trial. They like the fact that there is huge trainee involvement. The API scheme we're the biggest outside COVID by miles. Over 150 of you have signed up. We're recruiting NHS patients from private hospitals, which is a novelty for, and as more and more NHS patients get their surgery in private hospitals, we're doing more of that. We've got e-consent going, and actually it costs them no more money to give us that extension. I mentioned the API scheme. As I say, we've got 150 trainees enrolled. We can have 2 surgical trainees in each hospital and a radiological trainee in each hospital. So, I think these sorts of things count far more now than writing case reports and small papers. and being involved in these trials. I hope that's how your local ARCP sees that. If you do get involved, I'm a total believer in the collaborative authorship approach. So you contribute, you get your GMC number on those clinical reference forms, you will be included in all these papers that will come out of this study. And I suspect there will be lots. And then finally, before I take any questions, if you've got any, I know it's the end of the day for you, there's some contact details, and there was a QRI code on the sunflower flyer I had earlier. But please do get in touch. And if you either get in touch with me, my email address is giles.toogood@nhs.net. Do drop me a line. Very happy to engage, very happy to talk, because this is massively driven by people like you guys. And I think ultimately this is all about overtreatment. My hunch is that this group of patients do not need MRCPs, and it would be a huge change, not only in this country, but in most of the world. There are only 2 places in the world that do regular cholangiograms, and that is Scandinavia and Australia, and their rate is up at about 95%. But everywhere else, we're just the same. So all over Europe, they're the same as us. Across America, they're the same as us. Anyway, I will stop there. Please fire off if you've got any questions. James, anyone? No problem.
Just before any questions, sorry, I forgot to mention at the start, we record the day. Are you happy for your session recorded, and then we can, hopefully more people can see it that couldn't attend the training. But I'll see if there's any questions coming through the chat. There's a question that's come through about sort of the advantages after the associate PI scheme, or sort of what happens.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, actually. And I know NHR are looking at that, and so are a number of us. And I think that we've now developed we've got 2 trainees on our executive group, our sunflower executive group, who contribute massively, and they both were APIs. We've also got regional representatives who have all been APIs, but I think NIHR there's more to come, and I think there will be, if you like, another stage after being an API. Sometimes I think it's very frustrating that you can only be an API for 6 months and then that's it. So I do get that. So I think there's nothing formal at this moment in time across the board. Certainly we have structure within Sunflower, but I think we're unique to most trials, most studies.
I thought it's interesting that you said that quite a few, you're getting increasing numbers of the sort of urgent gallbladders coming through.
Yeah.
I think lots of our experience would be that we're not doing many sort of acute or hot gallbladders due to the sort of take pressures and theatre space. And then the problem is that, sort of as you said,
not doing what? Sorry,
we're not doing many sort of emergency or sort of early gallbladders or hot gallbladders, just because we haven't got the capacity. Are you sort of an advocate of doing those, or?
So I lost you there, James. Say that again.
Is it something you sort of advocate? So in your experience of trying to do sort of more sort of urgent, within index admission, sort of hot lap choles?
you know, if it was your sister, your mum, who had cholecystitis or biliary colic, when would you want their gallbladder done?
Well, I guess it depends on sort of how long they've been loitering around, but we sooner rather than later.
Quick as possible. You do not want that pain again. You know, so it's inadequate that we as an NHS don't, you know, lap choles come very low on the pecking order on an acute list because, you know, they can get away with being treated conservatively. So that's just the way of the world. And I saw a patient today who's been waiting 3 years at York for their lap chole. You know, we can now do them in Leeds at eight weeks, you know, having presented acutely, and everywhere's different. But I think the gold standard has to be you get on with it as soon as you can.
Right. Not sure if there are any other questions. I think that looks like we're probably done. I can't see any other questions coming from Matt unless anyone else has sudden ones they want to ask. But really appreciate you taking the time to present.
My pleasure.
It's sure to be a fascinating series of research. And like you said, I'm sure people will get in touch and get involved.
Well, that'd be great. And good luck to you all. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye.